Hey, it's Wilson. In my last video, I covered the 3 basic things that make up the exposure triangle. In that video, I mentioned how I was going to make a separate video going over each setting. And one of my subscribers commented, you should make a video on f-stops next. So that's what I'm going to do today. Let's get started. First, a little review from my last video. The smaller the f number, the more light that gets let in.
So for example, an f-stop of 3.5 will let in more light than an f-stop of 5.6.
Now that the easy part is covered, let's go over the most important part of f-stops. The aperture that you use determines how much of your image will be in focus, which in other words is your depth of field or your focal plane. A low f-stop, such as f1.8, will have what is called a shallow depth of field, whereas the f-stop that's higher, such as f11, will have what is called a deeper depth of field.
Here's this concept visualized.
Now, let's talk about how this applies in the real world over several different genres of photography. With macros, you actually want to start at a fairly high aperture, such as f8, and this is for a very specific reason. The closer you are to your subject, the blurrier the background will get, regardless of what f-stop you use. Sure, f-stops matter, and they can be really important, but the one thing you gotta really remember is, the closer you get to your subject, the blurrier the background will be. When shooting macros, you gotta keep in mind, you're only a few inches away from your subject. So if you're shooting something like f4, you're gonna have a very shallow focal plane.
For example, if you were taking a photo of a leaf at f4 with a macro, there's a chance that only the first millimeter of the tip of the leaf would be in focus. So for macros, you actually want to expand that depth of field by shooting from f8 and onwards.
With food photography, you're going to be fairly close to your subject still. So depending on what lens you use, and if you're shooting a crop body or a full frame, you're going to be using anywhere between f1.8 to f4.
The reason why you may want to use a higher aperture is that sometimes you may want to show the details of all the ingredients on the plate. Maybe not everything needs to be sharp, but if there's a certain fig puree in the background and it's all blurred out to look like what looks like a brown mound, then the depth of field would be too shallow. For your top-down shots, you actually want to shoot at f4 or maybe even a little bit higher. Just in case you're actually at a bit of an angle to the table, you don't want one edge of the image to be a little blurry, so you want to increase that depth of field.
So depending on your gear and what you're shooting, I'd shoot with an aperture between f1.8 to f4. For portraits, depending on your gear, I'd shoot between f1.8 to 2.8.
Generally speaking, for portraits, you want that creamy background blur, so you want to use a shallow depth of field to create that effect. The only time you really want to stray from that is if you're shooting more fashiony images, where you want it to focus more on the hair, the makeup, and the details in the clothing. And in those cases, you might want to shoot from f4 all the way to even f8. Generally though, for most people photography, I stick between f1.8 to 2.8. For group photos, I go between f2.8 to f8. The more people there are in the photo, the more you want to increase your depth of field. For example, if there are 2 rows of people, shooting at f2.8 would likely leave the second row of people looking slightly out of focus, so you would shoot 2 rows of people at f4 or even 5 to compensate for that. If you're shooting a large group photo, you may want to step it up to f8 or even 11 so everyone's faces are in focus. One important thing to note here is the wider your focal length is, the less you have to worry about the people in the back being out of focus. Because the wider your focal length, the less depth of field your lens has. For landscapes and architecture, you really want a deep depth of field as you want all the details in the interiors, buildings, or landscapes to be in focus. One advantage to raising your f-stop is, the higher your f-stop is, the sharper your images become, to a point. Most lenses are generally sharpest at around half of what their maximum f-stop is. So if your lens's maximum f-stop is 16, it would be sharpest around f8. With that said, if you continue increasing the f-stop past this point, your depth of field will still increase, but the sharpness will decrease. The sharpness with most modern lenses is really negligible. So there you have it, a comprehensive breakdown of f-stops. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to leave them in the comments down below and I'll be happy to get back to you.
See you next time.